Rostov-on-Don, 1962. Across the board sits Rashid Nezhmetdinov, a master feared above all others for the fury of his attacks. Facing him, Oleg Chernikov, settling in for a quiet Sicilian, expecting a calm repetition and an easy draw. If a quiet game like this is how you'd like to fall asleep, take a moment to subscribe. There's a new one each week. Chernikov would not get his quiet game. Early on, Nezhmetdinov does something that seems to defy all reason. He gives up his queen, the strongest piece on the board, and asks for almost nothing back. In its place, he keeps two small pieces, working together in perfect harmony. And the black queen, for all her power, finds she has nowhere useful to go. Many have called it one of the greatest queen sacrifices ever played. It has been studied and loved for more than 60 years now, and tonight we'll watch it unfold, slowly. Close your eyes and let the 64 squares take shape in the dark before you. So, let the board take shape in the dark. Two armies, still whole, the pieces waiting in the quiet before anything has been decided. White moves first and pushes the king's pawn 2 squares to e4. Black answers on the other wing. A pawn slides to c5, the Sicilian, an old and stubborn reply. White brings out a knight to f3, reaching toward the center. Black develops a knight of his own to c6. Now white strikes in the middle. A pawn advances to d4. Black takes it. The c-pawn captures on d4. And white recaptures, the knight from f3 coming down to d4, sitting proud in the center. Black chooses a quiet, patient setup. A pawn steps to g6. This is the dragon. Black will fianchetto his dark bishop and aim it down the long diagonal like a drawn bow. White develops the last knight to c3. And black completes the idea. The bishop settles on g7, staring clear across the board toward white's corner. White develops the dark bishop to e3, a calm supporting move. Black brings the king's knight to f6, eyeing the center. Now white places the light bishop on c4, its gaze fixed on the soft square in front of black's king. Black tucks the king away, castling on the king side. King to g8, rook to f8. White slides the bishop back 1 square to b3, out of harm's way and still aimed at f7. Let us hold the picture here for a moment. White is uncastled still, but coiled, knight strong on d4, both bishops trained on the king side, queen and rooks ready behind them. Black sits behind a snug little fortress on g8, that long dark bishop humming on the great diagonal. It is a dragon, and both sides know the dragon can catch fire. And now black reaches out with a bold, provocative move. The knight leaps from f6 to g4. It attacks the bishop on e3, offering a trade and daring white to move the queen. White does not retreat the bishop. Instead, the queen sweeps out and snaps up the knight, capturing on g4. A small surprise. White would rather have his queen in the open air than shuffle a bishop back. But black had a sting waiting. The knight from c6 crashes down onto d4. It captures the proud central knight, and suddenly it forks, hitting the bishop on b3 and threatening a nasty check on the soft c2 square. The quiet opening has become a brawl. White steps the queen sideways to h4. From h4, the queen leans toward the black king and keeps an eye on the loose pieces around the board. Black brings his own queen into the fight, out to a5. It guards. It eyes the knight on c3. It looks toward white's queenside. Both queens are prowling now. At last white castles, kingside. The king slips to g1, the rook to f1. Safety and a rook brought to life. Let us look again, because the storm is close. White's queen stands on h4, far advanced, staring down at the dark squares near black's king. That knight on c3 has its eye on the d5 square, a beautiful outpost, deep in black's half. Black's knight sits strong on d4, his queen is out on a5, and his dark bishop still guards the home of his king from g7. That bishop is the one wall standing between white's queen and the dark squares around the king. Remember it. Now black makes a natural, tempting move. The bishop swings from g7 to f6. It attacks the white queen on h4, and it seems to gain a tempo, chase the queen, then get on with the game. Modern analysis calls this the best try, and yet it walks straight into one of the most famous replies ever played. Because the queen does not run. White plays it. The queen captures on f6. Take a moment with this. The queen has taken the bishop, and it stands right next to black's king, defended by nothing. Black can simply take the queen with the pawn. He is being handed the most powerful piece on the board. This is the sacrifice this whole game is remembered for. Why give up the queen? Feel the shape of it. That bishop on f6 was black's dark square guardian. Gone, the squares around his king go bare and grey. White will get a bishop and a knight for the queen, and a pawn-torn king with no dark squared defender left alive. It is not a combination that ends in 3 moves. It is a slow, deep bet on a burning position. Black, of course, does not take at once. He has a check to throw in first. The knight jumps from d4 to e2, check. A clever in-between move, grab a tempo, snatch a piece, before recapturing the queen. White must answer the check, and does so the strongest way. The knight from c3 captures on e2. Now black takes the queen. The e-pawn captures on f6. And there it is. The great white queen is gone from the board. Count what remains. For that queen, white holds a bishop and a knight a little less in raw material. But look at black's king. His kingside pawns are doubled and ugly, a lonely pair on f6 and f7. The dark squares, g7, h6, e5, the whole shadowed lane to his king, belong to white now. A colder modern eye confirms it. White's attack is worth more than the queen he gave. This is the wager Nezhmetdinov made, and everything that follows is him proving it, patiently, piece by piece. So watch the pieces come. White withdraws the knight from e2 back to c3. Unhurried, he is rerouting it toward that dream square, d5. Black tries to breathe. The rook lifts from f8 to e8, taking the open file, looking to trade or defend. And now the knight arrives. From c3 it springs to d5. Feel how it dominates. From d5 it forks the f6 pawn and reaches into the heart of black's camp, and it cannot easily be driven away. Black defends the wounded pawn. The rook drops back to e6, shielding f6 along the 6th rank. It is an awkward, hunched little defense. The rook tied to a pawn, doing a menial job. Now white builds. The bishop steps from e3 to d4. And there it sits, on the long dark diagonal, glaring straight at the pawn on f6, and the king huddled behind it. Bishop on d4, knight on d5, 2 minor pieces aimed like spears at one wounded king. Let us see the whole board as it stands. White has no queen, but he has harmony. Bishop on b3 cutting one diagonal, bishop on d4 cutting the other, knight planted on d5, rooks waking on the open files. Black has his extra material and his queen on a5, far away on the edge, a world from where the danger is. His king sits on g8 behind two limp f-pawns, and his rook crouches on e6 doing guard duty. The dark squares near that king are a silent open road, and White's army is already marching down it. Black feels the pressure and tries to make room. The king steps across to g7. Off the back rank, a little air by the pawns, but closer too to the fire. The bishop on d4 and that lonely f6 pawn are staring right at him. And White, unhurried as ever, gathers himself to strike again. White's rook on a1 stirs and slides quietly across to d1. Remember where he stands. He is playing without his queen. Two bishops, a knight, two rooks, all he has against her. And he means to have every last one of them pointing at the black king. Black answers softly. The pawn on d7 steps forward one square to d6. A shade loose, that move. Nudging the b pawn to b6 was the steadier hold. This one leaves a faint draft around the king that White will find. The rook lifts off d1 and climbs to d3. Up off the ground now, ready to swing along the third rank toward the king. The best square for it. Black's bishop, asleep on c8, wakes and steps to d7. The most solid choice, eyeing the light squares, meaning to trade itself into the attack. The rook glides again from d3 to f3. And now it leans on f6 on the pawn shielding the black king. The bishop slips from d7 out to b5, reaching all the way across the board toward White's back rank. White's dark bishop draws back from d4 to c3. And see what it does from there. It lies on the long dark diagonal, c3, d4, e5, f6, g7, aimed straight through the f6 pawn at the king behind it. Hold the whole picture a moment. White's king on g1, both rooks stacked on the f-file at f1 and f3, the knight planted on d5, bishops on b3 and c3. Black's king on g7, his queen far out on a5, rooks on a8 and e6, the bishop reaching in to b5. Every white piece drifts toward that corner, like a tide coming in. Black feels it and hurries the queen home, from a5 all the way back to d8. The best she can do, coming back to guard the dark squares and the pawn on f6. And now, White strikes. The knight on d5 leaps in and takes the pawn on f6. The shield is torn away. The knight sits right in front of the black king. And behind it, the bishop on c3 glares down the long diagonal at everything. This is the finest move on the board. The whole position was quietly built for it. Black snatches at a chance of his own. The bishop darts from b5 into e2. From e2 it forks both white rooks at once, the one on f3 and the one on f1. But this is the misstep. There was no time for it. Bringing the other rook back to c8 to defend was the way to cling on. Now White's attack simply arrives first. White does not blink. The knight takes again from f6 onto h7, and it is check. He gives no thought at all to the forked rooks. He rips away another pawn from the king's face, and the king must move. The king slides one square from g7 into the corner shelter at g8. White swings the rook across from f3 over to h3. Pointed straight down the open h-file at the bare king, lovely to the eye. Though a colder, modern look would send the knight back to f6 with check first, and finish even sooner. Still, the arrow is aimed at the king, and the game stays firmly White's. Black's rook lifts from e6 to e5. Sliding along the fifth rank, trying to throw a body across the path of the attack. White's f-pawn pushes to f4, prodding at that very rook on e5. Black cashes in the fork. The bishop on e2 takes the rook on f1. Tempting to pocket a rook, but it was the wrong moment. Swinging his own rook to h5 to block that file would have fought harder. The white king simply takes the bishop back, stepping onto f1. See where everything stands now. The white king on f1, a queen and now a rook behind, bishops on b3 and c3, a knight stranded far off on h7, a single rook on h3. Black looks a fortune ahead. A queen on d8, two rooks, on e5 and a8. But his king hides on g8 with almost nothing around it, and white's pieces lean and lean toward that corner. Black brings the last rook out from a8 to c8. Again, the stubborn defense on h5 was the tougher road. The h-file is where he will be hurt. White's dark bishop returns to d4, leaning once more on the rook at e5. Simply taking that rook was cleaner, but the bishop's aim at the king is hard to give up. Black pushes a pawn on the far wing, from b7 to b5. A little space gained far away from the fire. The knight, which has wandered from d5 to f6 to h7, now settles on g5. And from g5 it stares at two soft squares beside the king, f7 and h7. Black's rook slides along to c7, meaning to hold the 7th rank. Now let the whole board settle in your mind before what comes next. The black king sits on g8 behind a single pawn on g6 with one more guard on f7. His queen rests at home on d8, one rook out on e5, the other just come to c7. Pawns scattered on a7, b5, d6. White is still a whole queen down, but every piece he owns is trained on that one corner. The bishop on b3 rakes the light diagonal, b3, c4, d5, e6 straight into the pawn by the king. The bishop on d4 burns down the dark diagonal toward g7 and h8. The knight crouches on g5. The rook waits on h3, at the head of the open file. 3 pieces and a rook, all aimed at one square of shelter. Now watch. The bishop on b3 plunges in and takes the pawn on f7, check. It throws itself down on the very doorstep of the king, and the king cannot take it. The knight on g5 covers f7. So the rook must come and deal with it. The rook swings from c7 onto f7 and grabs the bishop. The only move, and exactly what white wanted. The rook is lured onto f7, drawn off the back rank, pulled into the trap. Now the second gift. The rook crashes down the file from h3 to h8, check. Right beside the king, offered up for nothing. And it cannot be refused. Nothing else covers that square. The king must take. The king steps into the corner and takes the rook onto h8. 2 whole pieces thrown away now, a bishop and a rook, and white sinks even deeper into debt. But look where the king stands, sealed in the corner, and it is the knight's turn. The knight springs from g5 onto f7, check. And here is the whole point of it laid bare. From f7 the knight checks the king on h8, and in the very same breath it strikes the queen, away across the board on d8. The fork this whole storm was built to reach, the king must run, and as it runs, the queen falls. The king climbs out of the corner from h8 to h7. There is nothing at all to be done for the queen. The knight leaps across and takes her on d8. And there it is, The queen white gave away long ago comes back to him, one clean off the board. 2 bishops, 2 rooks, spent one by one, and every one of them was only ever the price of this single moment. Black takes what he can in return. The rook on e5 grabs the pawn on e4. The knight trots out of the corner from d8 to c6. Safe and ready to come back into the fight. Black's rook sweeps down and takes the pawn on f4 with check. A last flicker of spite. The king is touched and must step aside. The white king walks calmly across from f1 to e2. Out of the checks, out of danger. And there the storm has blown itself out. Count what is left standing. White has a bishop and a knight where black has only a single rook. And a safe king besides, with his pawns whole. The man who began all this without a queen ends it a piece to the good. The whole wild sacrifice, paid back in full, with interest. The rest is only a matter of time, and time is entirely on his side. Let the pieces stand just where they are. The hunt is over. The board can go still. It is finished. Let it rest. And there the game rests, the final position holding still on the board. Nothing more will move now. The pieces have said all they came to say. Let the squares soften at their edges, the light and dark blurring into one. The kings, the rooks, the last few pawns, let them settle and fade. The board loosens its shape, dissolving quietly into the dark around you. There is nothing left to follow, nothing left to picture. It is all put away. You can let the whole of it go now and stay just where you are. Rest easy. The game will keep exactly as it ended. Sleep well. Good night.